back to throwing up any protectionist barriers, toward other countries, or even, some things getting in the way of this, the smooth implementation of these pacts with Taiwan. We certainly will see an increased level of protectionism around the world. We saw elements of it with swine flu. We're seeing very overt movements with countries, especially starting in the U.S., taking the lead to start to erect barriers, and these will again be another headwind to a return to anywhere near even subpar growth in the near future.
Trade data today may actually show that things are still pretty tough for Taiwan. How much can China actually help the island?
Well, again, I think it's largely psychological. Of course, the wall of money, so to speak, that everyone talks about coming out of China when these kind of things are put into place will be a boon to markets. It will have a good psychological effect. But it remains to be seen just how much, because at the end of the day, Taiwan, as much as China, as much as Japan, as much as the rest of Asia, is highly dependent on the U.S. consumer, and that consumer is not back yet. So without that, they're all somewhat cosmetic, but they're positive steps, and they're necessary steps for a fully functioning global integrated economy in the future. It's certainly not in and of itself the end of Taiwan's problems.
With your skepticism over the state of the banks and your general feeling that this whole stress test thing has been some sort of a mind trick game, just trying to manipulate the mood among people, is Asia and its stimulus and its surgical programs to stimulate domestic demand to offset whatever problems America is having, is that having the intended effect? Would you be more bullish on the Asia on the PAC rim?
Yeah, absolutely. And I said last summer that the one thing that makes me positive about Asia is the fact that China has money and they're going to implement it. They're going to implement a stimulus package, and they're now doing it. The problem is that in no way will come close to replacing the type of demand that we had out of the U.S. during the hyper-consumption wealth effect from the housing bubble. And also, a lot of it's going into construction, and that's going to benefit the economy within China. They're going to have some outward effects around the rest of Asia, but it will not replace in any way.
Okay.
But it is a positive, and it will help buoy Asia.
Here's one from Rishi, just to kick off our little party here. Will the after effect of the financial crisis cause more harm than the crisis itself did? It's kind of like, who was it, FDR, right? We have nothing to fear but fear itself. Does this hurt more now, or are we really facing a real whopper down the line, Kurt?
Look, it's a great question, and this is what I have said all along. The global reset that has to take place to get us back to a point, to contract to a point where we can grow sustainably again, is going to be painful, and the key is it's inevitable. Without it, we cannot begin to grow. So the steps that are being taken by the massive stimulus packages being put in place and the massive amount of money to save the zombie banks, what could be zombie banks in the U.S. financial system, when there could be systems put in place to have an orderly wind down, separating the bad assets. The proper policies haven't been put into place. The money that's being wasted will come back to haunt us. It cannot be printed and used for these purposes and not cost us later on. And the problem is they're not going to stop the inevitable contraction, and that's what we're going to find out. These green shoots will not yield lush meadows next year. That's the problem.
So it's not going to be inflation.
Down the line, it will be inflation.
It will be inflation that comes back and kills
everything they're doing, every policy put in place by the U.S. Treasury, by governments around the world, are inflationary by nature. They're fighting a wave of deflation during this contraction. And at the end, when they have to pull that, if they don't pull it out, it will be massive inflation. When they begin to pull it out, that's going to retard growth, and we're going to have inflation anyway. Right. So if we just let the reset happen, take some of the stimulus money, take some of the TARP money, take some of the TALF money, all of this, and cushion the blow. Put it into programs to help the people stave off the depression-like effects while we go through this transition, and the transition to a more balanced global trade society, with China bringing on domestic demand as one of their main drivers of growth, and the U.S. becoming an export, retooled for exports again. This is a 5 to 10 year process. We can't avoid it. We can't continue to grow on unsustainable debt.
So when all these policymakers were putting in place all these collective stimulus programs, it never occurred to anybody that they are planting the seeds of a disaster.
It may have occurred to them, but it was short-term thinking. They were reactive. They got themselves into position by not foreseeing, and this is why it is a problem when Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson came out continually in the spring of 2007 and the summer of 2007 and said subprime will be contained, because that proved that no steps were being taken. They couldn't foresee the problems coming, which is quite unbelievable. when many were foreseeing it at the same time. None of the steps were put in place to forestall. It may have been too late at that point. What could have at least cushioned the blow? It exacerbated the problem. More risk was taken on, and that will mean a further fall. So they ended up having to fight fires, and that's the point I'm getting to. So they haven't been able to put in place a long-term policy that will bring us back in a palatable way to the level we have to be to grow sustainably again. And that's the key. This administration and this Congress in the U.S. and with the Fed behind them do not want to make the hard choices. They have not done it yet, and there is no sign that they're going to do it until they're forced. And then it's too late.
Bill writes in, taking some issue with what we've been talking about today. Bill Johansson, if you put this up, please. Reduction in joblessness, banks passing the stress test, and stabilization of housing. This economic recovery is for real, isn't it? You would think that the stock market rally is justified. Why don't you get on board? You have answered this to some degree already. Just recap it for Bill.
Well, let's just say this. Sorry, Bill, but we're living on two different planets. I would love to get on board if you send me some transport to get there. Unfortunately, I live on planet Earth, and all the things that you just described are really not happening. The banks passing the stress test do not mean a stable financial system in the U.S. We will find that out when we have the resets coming, the subprime, as well as prime mortgages, the foreclosures, the resets, again, of the adjustable rate mortgages, credit cards, auto loans. We've heard the laundry list ad infinitum. These are very real. Next, I can't, did you say unemployment? We're seeing, again, a reduction in the quantum of unemployment rising. It is still going to rise to levels that are not going to allow the consumer to come back and drive growth. We're seeing blips, and that's being taken by the markets and by many players to think that the recovery is underway, and it's not.
Okay. John writes in asking, and I guess he sort of concurs with you to a certain extent. When will commercial real estate implode, and could it take the multinational banks down with it?
It very well could. This is the next shoe to drop. We've been talking about it. I think I mentioned it here 6 months ago. I don't even remember. When is the key? Most likely before the end of 2009 and into the first half of 2010, this is what is going to be the main issue, commercial real estate. It's out there. It's unavoidable. There's nothing that can be done to avoid this being a big hit on the banks. And that's why, again, these stress tests are giving false hope, because those issues that the banks have to deal with, not one penny of toxic assets, of these commercial loans, which are going to turn into far more toxic assets, have been reduced through these stress tests. So again, that is the next shoe to drop, I would say, within a year from now.
Edward writes in, this just came in. Edward writes in, how come all deniers, okay, he says, don't mention my last name. I didn't. Edward says, why are all deniers of the recent rally Republicans?
I'm not sure how Edward knows, maybe because you have a headline on there that says,
actually, that's not
McCain
true,
will
is
win.
it? I don't think Paul Krugman thinks this is real either.
No, he doesn't. And there are a lot of economists on both sides that don't believe it. And I would just say that, look, I'm a fiscal conservative, certainly not a Republican of the last two administrations based on that. So anyway, I consider myself a realist. And Ed, sorry, the Democrats, you can enjoy your day in the sun right now, but if you continue down the road you're on, it will come back to haunt you.
Okay, let's get an Asian question in here. Laura from Encinitas, California. Does China and Taiwan's decision to no longer settle trade between the U.S. dollars and move to the yuan weaken the dollar? Is this basically curtains for the dollar, perhaps?
Well, it's not necessarily in and of itself curtains for the dollar, but the number of steps that are being taken behind the scenes and overtly by China, the comments, again, diversifying its holdings bit by bit. These are things that are going to chip away at the credibility of the dollar. And again, once we hit the inflection point of deflation to inflation, we're going to have major problems for the U.S. dollar. You know that's how I feel, and this is one step in the process.
Okay, one more second. Willie Pasek is in Tokyo, and of course Kirby here with me in Hong Kong. Willie, was it right or wrong? I had somebody on my morning call program the other day, a former legislator who represented the medical constituency, who said, one person, you don't need to lock down everybody, especially if they didn't even come within 20 floors of contact.
Well, I think, if you look at specific cases, yeah, you can make the argument that there were some overreach, some government officials went a bit crazy. However, I think, in some ways, there is this tendency at this point to err on the side of extreme caution, given the events of 2003, given the events of 2005. Hong Kong, China especially, Hong Kong was actually pretty proactive with SARS, but China was criticized pretty aggressively for its response to SARS. And perhaps some of this response you're seeing this time around, this heavy-handed response, is a bit of that. It's a bit of sort of making up for the steps we're taking back then. I think that, it's easy for us to sit back now if If swine flu dies